At my sister's wedding, while everyone was raising their glasses to celebrate her, my mother turned to me and said, I was the most useless child she had. For 34 years, I had stayed quiet, swallowing the sting of her words, believing if I just worked harder, loved deeper, gave more, maybe she would finally see me. But in that moment, with 200 people watching, something inside me broke. And for the first time, I smiled, stood tall, and answered her back with one sentence that changed our family forever. My name is Rachel Miller, and I am 34 years old. When I look back on my life, it always feels like Chicago mornings, in the fall brisk air, the honk of traffic along Michigan Avenue, the clatter of commuters rushing toward glass towers that catch the sunrise. That's the rhythm of the city I've built my career in, the place where I've tried to carve out my own identity. I'm a senior marketing manager at a downtown agency, someone who leads client meetings, shapes campaigns, and knows how to tell stories that can shift opinions. Yet for all the success I've managed to build here in the city, the story of my family has always overshadowed mine. The Miller family looks picture-perfect from the outside. We grew up in Naperville, a suburb lined with maple trees and neatly cut lawns. My mother, Evelyn, 62, still lives in that house. She has always been active in her church's women's group, the kind of woman who bakes casseroles for neighbors, yet never misses an opportunity to compare her children in public. My father, Thomas, 65, is a retired engineer who now does part-time consulting. He is soft-spoken, the sort of man who prefers to avoid conflict, even when silence hurts more than words. Then there's Daniel, my older brother. He's 37 now, a doctor who opened a small clinic in Milwaukee. To my mother, he's the golden boy, the example she holds up at every gathering. She loves to tell anyone who will listen about the patients who trust him, about the sacrifices he's made, about how proud she is to be his mother. Next is Kate, my younger sister. She's 29 and already a partner-track attorney at a downtown Chicago law firm. She's the bride-to-be, the center of every conversation lately, the daughter who makes my mother beam with pride. And then there's me, stuck in the middle. I learned early that being the middle child meant fighting for attention in a household where there was never enough praise to go around. My mother never missed a chance to say how brilliant Daniel was, or how polished Kate looked. My achievements always seemed like afterthoughts, footnotes in a family story that never quite included me as a main character. My grandmother Maggie has always been the exception. She's 84 now, a retired librarian who speaks her mind without apology. At family dinners, when my mother's voice rose with praise for Daniel and Kate, it was often Grandma who cut through, reminding everyone that kindness and character mattered more than titles. She's the only one who's ever scolded my mother openly, the only one who's told her that she can be cruel without realizing it. In many ways, Grandma has been my compass, showing me that strength doesn't always mean being loud, but it does mean speaking the truth when it counts. I remember one afternoon not long ago driving down Lakeshore Drive with the city skyline rising ahead, thinking about how different my two worlds are. In Chicago, I'm respected, I'm trusted, I lead a team that looks to me for guidance. At home, in the eyes of my mother, I'm the daughter who never measured up. That split has followed me my whole life, the ache of being invisible no matter how hard I worked. The truth is, I've carried that weight for years. Through college, when I graduated with honors, through my first job, when I stayed late to prove myself, through every promotion I earned without a single congratulatory phone call from home. I told myself it didn't matter, that the recognition of colleagues and clients should be enough. But it never was, not when your own family makes you feel small. This story begins where all of those feelings collided. It begins with Kate's wedding, the glittering event my mother dreamed about for years, the day my younger sister would wear white and be celebrated by 200 guests in a ballroom overlooking the Chicago River. For my mother, it was the chance to parade her perfect daughter in front of friends, neighbors, and relatives. For me, it became something else entirely. It became the day my mother finally went too far, the day her words cut deeper than they ever had before, and the day I realized I didn't have to stay silent any longer. That wedding would become the turning point in my life, the moment when decades of being overlooked, dismissed, and diminished would reach their breaking point. It was supposed to be Kate's day, her celebration. But it became the stage where my family's secrets and my mother's favoritism were dragged into the light. And for once, I wasn't going to back down. When I think back to being a kid, the memories come in sharp flashes like photographs I can't quite put back in the album. I see myself in 4th grade standing in the school gym with a blue ribbon in my hand. I had won first place in the district art fair for a watercolor of the Chicago skyline at dusk. My art teacher was beaming. My classmates clapped politely, and I remember feeling that thrill of pride, believing for one second that maybe this was the thing that would finally make my mother look at me differently. But later that night at dinner, while the ribbon still lay on the counter next to the salt shaker, my mother only talked about Daniel. He had just won the regional science bee, and she told the story 3 times, laughing at the details, her eyes shining as she repeated how our Daniel just has such a brilliant mind. My ribbon went unnoticed. By dessert, she had folded it into a drawer with the bills and coupons, and I could feel the warmth of that small victory fade into the familiar chill of being overlooked. Holidays were always the worst. Thanksgiving in our house meant a long table in the dining room, turkey carved by my father, candles flickering. Relatives came in from out-of-town, neighbors stopped by, and inevitably the conversation turned to the Miller children. Evelyn loved her stage, her audience of friends and cousins. She would brag about Daniel's straight A's, how he shadowed a surgeon one summer, or how Kate, even as a teenager, carried herself like a young professional. And when eyes finally turned to me, she would wave a hand and say something like, "Oh, Rachel keeps busy too," before redirecting to another glowing story about my siblings. I remember staring down at my mashed potatoes, pushing them around the plate, praying someone would ask me a real question. They rarely did. At church, the comparisons cut even deeper. My mother thrived in the church's women's group, standing in the fellowship hall with coffee cups and hymnals on Sunday mornings. I can still hear her voice as she told Mrs. Henderson from down the street, "Well, not every child turns out to be a star. 2 out of 3 isn't bad, right?" She chuckled as if it were a harmless joke. The other women laughed politely, but I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks. I stood nearby clutching a stack of bulletins I was supposed to hand out, pretending I hadn't heard. But I had. I always did. There were nights I'd sit on the edge of my bed, homework spread out, listening to the hum of the television downstairs. I worked hard, every assignment neatly done, every test carefully studied for. I kept thinking if I earned enough gold stars, enough ribbons, enough grades, my mother would notice. She never really did. To her, I was the one who had to try twice as hard for half the result, and even then it wasn't worth mentioning. I remember once asking my father, "Why doesn't Mom ever talk about me the way she talks about Daniel and Kate?" He sighed, set down the newspaper, and rubbed his temples. "Your mom means well, Rachel," he said softly. She has her way of showing pride, but I never saw it not directed at me." His words felt like another excuse for her silence. Inside, I carried 2 voices. One whispered that I was invisible, destined to be the shadow in every family photograph. The other screamed for recognition, begging to be seen, to be valued, to be loved without conditions. I became an expert at wearing a mask, smiling at dinners, nodding along in conversations, hiding the sting of every dismissive glance. The years layered those feelings like bricks in a wall. By the time I reached high school, I stopped showing her my art projects. I entered competitions quietly, sometimes winning, sometimes not, but never bringing the certificates home. It was easier to protect myself by expecting nothing. At graduations, I smiled for the cameras while my mother clutched Daniel's plaques and Kate's debate trophies. I stood to the side, hands folded, learning that invisibility could also be a kind of armor. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to build that shield, a piece of me still wanted her approval. I wanted her to turn to a neighbor and say, "Rachel is doing so well, I'm proud of her." I wanted one moment where she looked at me the way she looked at Daniel or Kate. Eyes bright, chest lifted, voice full of pride. That moment never came. By the time I left for college, the pattern was cemented. I packed my bags with a mix of relief and resentment, telling myself that distance might finally give me peace. But the shadow of being the middle child followed me. Every phone call home circled back to Daniel's medical school or Kate's law internships. I was polite. I said congratulations. I kept my voice steady, but inside, I was still that fourth-grade girl holding a ribbon that no one cared about. Those memories never left me. They shaped me, hardened me, and deep down they fueled me. Because beneath the hurt was always the hunger. To be seen, to be recognized, to prove that I was more than the forgotten one. And that hunger is what carried me into adulthood. What pushed me to work harder, climb higher, and build a life that one day they would no longer be able to ignore. It wasn't until much later, standing in the middle of Kate's wedding reception, that all those years of silence and longing came crashing back. But long before that moment, the seed of who I had become had already been planted in those quiet, overlooked years. Most mornings, I step into the lobby of Brightwave Agency with a cup of coffee still too hot to drink, and a notebook already filled with ideas. The building hums with energy. Keycards clicking, sneakers squeaking across the polished floor, voices rising and falling in quick bursts of strategy. By 9 o'clock, I'm standing at the head of a glass-walled conference room, slides on the screen, my team waiting for direction. All right, let's walk through this pitch one more time, I tell them, pointing to the first slide. The client is a national retail brand looking to relaunch its image, and the pressure to deliver is heavy. But I thrive on that. I talk them through the flow, the narrative arc of the campaign, the way every color, every word is designed to evoke trust and energy. My voice grows stronger with each point, and I see heads nodding around the table. When we finish the rehearsal, one of my junior associates whispers, "This is going to land. I can feel it." An hour later, the real meeting begins. Executives in tailored suits file in shaking hands. I breathe deeply, steadying the nerves that always flare in the first moments. Then, the words pour out, practiced but alive. I can see their faces change as I paint the story, the family shopping together, the colors shifting from gray to vibrant, the tagline that ties it all together. When the final slide fades to black, there's a pause, the kind that could go either way. And then the client smiles. "This is exactly the direction we were hoping for," he says. Relief floods through me, but I keep my expression professional, thanking them, promising follow-up. After the clients leave, my team bursts into applause, laughter filling the room. I feel my cheeks warm, not just from pride, but from the joy of being surrounded by people who see me. Later, back at my desk, I find a note slipped onto my keyboard in Jennifer Adams' handwriting. "Excellent work. Let's discuss your future here." Jennifer is the kind of boss who doesn't hand out compliments lightly. At 45, she runs the agency with a sharp eye and a fierce reputation. When she calls me into her office that afternoon, she leans back in her chair, tapping a pen against her notebook. "Rachel," she says, "you've built something impressive here. The clients trust you. Your team respects you. I want you to start thinking about a director role." My heart skips, but I manage to nod calmly. "Thank you, Jennifer. That means a lot." She smiles briefly. "Don't thank me yet. Just keep doing what you're doing." By the time I leave the office, the city is drenched in golden light. I stop at the small apartment I've rented for the past few years, a modest one-bedroom on the north side of Chicago. The place smells faintly of the candle I lit that morning, and the potted plant by the window leans toward the last of the sun. It's not grand, but it's mine. I drop my bag, kick off my heels, and breathe in the quiet. An hour later, David arrives. He knocks twice before letting himself in, carrying a paper bag from the diner down the street. "You didn't have time to cook, did you?" he says, setting the bag on the counter. His tie is loosened. His sleeves rolled, the image of a teacher who has spent all day coaxing teenagers through Shakespeare and grammar drills. "I might have had cereal if you hadn't shown up," I admit, smiling as he unpacks burgers and fries. We eat at the small table by the window, our knees brushing. David listens intently as I tell him about the presentation. His eyes warm, his smile easy. "See, I told you they'd love it." "You're damn good at this, Rachel." His belief in me is steady, uncomplicated, the kind of support I never had at home. But even in moments like this, the shadow of my family lingers. Later that night, I call my mother, hoping maybe this time will be different. Mom, I say we landed a big client today. My boss is even considering me for a director role. I wait for a beat of silence on the line for the chance she might say she's proud. Instead, she chuckles softly. Director in advertising. Sweetheart, it's just slogans and pictures. It's not like real work, not like medicine or law. The words sting, though I knew they were coming. I swallow hard, force a laugh. Right, Mom? Just slogans. She shifts the conversation, quickly asking about Kate's wedding plans, about Daniel's clinic expansion. By the time we hang up, the glow from the day has dulled. I sit on the edge of my bed, staring at the skyline outside my window, lights flickering in the distance. It's a cruel irony in the city I am respected, even admired. At home, I'm still the child who can't measure up. Success in one world doesn't erase the ache in the other. I tell myself it shouldn't matter, that I should be content with what I've built, with David's steady love, with the career I've carved out from nothing. But deep down, I know the truth. No matter how high I climb in my mother's eyes, I remain the same. Just Rachel, the middle child, the one she never quite believed in. I lean back against the pillows, listening to the muffled hum of traffic below. My phone buzzes with a message from David. Proud of you. Always. I smile, holding on to that, because sometimes one voice of belief can carry you through the silence of an entire family. And yet the silence is heavy, and I can feel it pressing against me even as I close my eyes. The truth I rarely admitted out loud was that I had been carrying my family on my back for years. It started 3 winters ago when my mother called me one night, her voice shaky. Rachel, we're behind on the car lease again. I don't want your father to know he worries enough. Could you help out this month? That month turned into 36 of them. Every first Friday, $200 disappeared from my account, sent directly to cover the sleek sedan she drove to church and social events, the one she boasted about to her friends. By the time the lease ran its course, I had paid more than $43,000. She never once called it a gift, only help for the family. Then there was the surgery. My father Thomas needed his gallbladder removed. Insurance covered most of it, but not the nights in the hospital, not the extra tests, not the stack of bills that grew taller than the Bible on the coffee table. My mother phoned me again. We're short $5,000. They want payment before they release him. I don't know what else to do. I didn't hesitate. I took a vacation day, walked into the billing office, and wrote the check. I remember my father's tired smile as I wheeled him out of the hospital, unaware that his daughter had just emptied her savings account. Kate was next. She was in the middle of studying for the bar exam, her dream of becoming a lawyer just within reach. But she had overspent during a summer in Europe, a trip she told everyone was for cultural enrichment. When the exam fees and internship costs came due, she panicked. My mother called me late at night, the same tone in her voice. She can't miss this chance, Rachel. It's $10,000. Just until she's on her feet. I transferred the money the next morning. At Kate's swearing-in ceremony, my mother hugged her with tears in her eyes. She never mentioned who had quietly footed the bill. Daniel's need came after that. He was juggling medical school debt and trying to open his clinic in Milwaukee. Payments on his student loans fell behind. Again, it was my phone that rang. If people find out he defaulted, it could ruin his reputation, my mother whispered. Can you cover it? Just $10,000, he'll pay you back. He never did, and I never asked. The clinic thrived, and my mother beamed whenever she talked about her son, the successful doctor. I stayed silent, the hidden sponsor of their triumphs. I kept records of every payment, though not because I expected repayment. Screenshots, receipts, bank statements filed away in a folder on my laptop labeled Simply Family. Sometimes I scrolled through them late at night, the numbers lined up in neat columns. Evidence of my devotion. Proof that I wasn't useless even if no one else seemed to believe it. But the secrecy burned. Every time I asked if I could share what I had done, my mother's voice hardened. Rachel, families help each other. We don't keep score. And you know how Daniel and Kate would feel if they knew you had to bail them out. Better to let them believe they managed on their own. She made it sound noble, but what it really meant was that my sacrifices had to stay invisible. I would drive past the hospital, past Kate's downtown office, past Daniel's polished clinic, and feel a knot in my chest. I had built pieces of all of them, brick by brick, check by check, yet stood outside their spotlight. My name wasn't on the plaques, wasn't in the speeches, wasn't in my mother's proud announcements at family gatherings. I told myself I did it out of love. And part of me did. I wanted my father healthy, my sister successful, my brother stable. But another part of me hoped that maybe one day my mother would look at me differently. Maybe she'd realize I was the one who held the family together when things were crumbling. That moment never came. Instead, at every Sunday dinner, she would smile at Daniel's stories, clap at Kate's accomplishments, and when eyes turned to me, she would wave dismissively. "Rachel's busy with her advertising stuff," she would say, as if my career was nothing more than playing with crayons. Sometimes she would add, "She helps out here and there," never explaining how much, never admitting that without me, the polished image of our family might have cracked long ago. I sat there nodding, pretending it didn't matter, but inside, the bitterness grew. I was proud of what I had done. Proud that I could be counted on, but it was pride laced with resentment. Because no matter how much I gave, no matter how many sacrifices I made, I was still the daughter my mother dismissed as unimportant. One evening, after wiring another monthly payment for the car, I closed my laptop and whispered to the empty apartment, "I am the backbone of this family, and still I'm invisible." The words hung in the air, heavy and true. That was the duality of my life, respected in the city, indispensable in secret. But in my mother's eyes, still the most useless child she had. Kate's wedding was shaping up to be the kind of event my mother had fantasized about for years. The Hilton downtown was booked months in advance, ballrooms dripping with chandeliers, menus printed on heavy cardstock with gold trim. 200 guests were expected, family colleagues from Kate's law firm, Daniel's medical partners, church friends, and every neighbor my mother wanted to impress. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a spectacle. I tried to help in whatever ways I could. My cousin Emily, only 27 but already working as a wedding planner, was running point on everything. She dragged me along for vendor meetings, rehearsals, and last-minute walkthroughs. One afternoon, we stood in the ballroom, tape measure in hand, squinting at where the florist intended to build the arch. Emily jotted notes in her planner. "The chairs need to be shifted back by at least 2 feet, otherwise the aisle looks cramped," she muttered. I knelt to check the spacing, my hair falling out of its clip, and nodded. We moved from chairs to table linens, from lighting cues to cake placement. By evening, my feet ached, but I felt oddly grateful for the distraction. Emily kept up a cheerful chatter, though I caught her glancing at me once, biting her lip. Later, while we checked the centerpieces in a side room, she finally spoke. "Rachel," she said cautiously, "I don't know if I should tell you this, but I overheard your mom earlier." I stiffened. "What did she say this time?" Emily hesitated. She was talking to the florist, and she laughed, saying, "You're just here to fill space. That Kate's the real jewel of the family. She said you'll probably just stand in the background of the photos." I swallowed, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "That sounds about right," I said, my voice too light. Emily looked pained, as if she wanted to apologize on my mother's behalf, but I waved it off. "It's fine. I'm used to it." But it wasn't fine. Later, driving home through the city's evening traffic, her words replayed in my head, "Just here to fill space." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing back the sting in my eyes. When I reached my apartment, a thick envelope sat wedged in my mailbox. At first, I thought it was another set of utility bills, but the return address read, First National Bank. I carried it upstairs, tore it open at the kitchen counter, and felt my stomach drop. Inside was a notice confirming a $15,000 line of credit recently opened under my name. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. I hadn't applied for any loan. The letter listed my address correctly, My social security number, even my place of employment. I called the number on the letter, heart pounding. After 15 minutes of elevator music and scripted politeness, a woman on the line confirmed the account. It was opened last month, she explained. Electronic signatures are on file. I didn't sign anything, I said firmly. I want this flagged immediately. She promised to escalate the issue, but when I hung up, dread pooled in my stomach. I could guess exactly who had done it. My mother had all my information. Birth date, social security number, even old pay stubs from the time I'd helped her with paperwork. The thought of her forging my name made me feel both furious and sick. I sat at the table, the letter spread out before me, the city lights flickering through the window. For a moment, I considered driving straight to Naperville, slamming the papers down on the kitchen counter, demanding an explanation. But Kate's wedding loomed only days away, and I could already imagine my mother's voice. Don't ruin this for your sister. So I shoved the letter back into the envelope, slid it into a drawer, and told myself I'd deal with it later. The following weekend, I was back at the Hilton with Emily walking through the rehearsal schedule. My mother swept through the lobby like a queen greeting guests, fussing over Kate's dress fitting, barely acknowledging me. At one point, I caught her eye across the room. She smiled sweetly at the couple she was talking to, then turned to me with that sharp, measuring look I knew so well. A silent reminder, don't make this about you. I kept my head down, carrying boxes of programs, adjusting table numbers, making myself useful, Emily whispered once. You don't have to do all this, but I shrugged. It's easier this way. By the time we finished, the ballroom gleamed everything in its place. Guests would arrive in 2 days. Champagne would flow, speeches would be made, and my mother would finally get the grand display she had always wanted. And me, I would stand where she expected me to. On the sidelines, invisible, holding back a secret that was growing heavier by the day. The first notes of the string quartet floated through the grand ballroom, soft and elegant, filling the space with a sense of anticipation. Light spilled from the chandeliers above, glittering against crystal glasses and the polished marble floor. Kate moved through the room in her gown, white satin that hugged her frame perfectly, the kind of dress that made every head turn. Laughter rose in clusters as guests admired the flowers, snapped photos, and balanced champagne flutes in manicured hands. I sat at a round table near the middle of the room with David, who looked sharp in his suit but relaxed in his smile. He reached for my hand under the table, giving it a squeeze, as if to anchor me. You ready for your speech? He whispered. I nodded, though my stomach was a knot. I had rehearsed the words over and over, wanting to celebrate my sister genuinely, even if I knew I would never get the same in return. Across the room, Daniel held court with a group of colleagues. His voice carried easily, laced with confidence. We just expanded the clinic this spring, he said, puffing out his chest. It's been nonstop patients, but worth it. We're even adding another physician next year. The group murmured admiration, and my mother hovered nearby. Her eyes alight like every success of his reflected back on her. Kate basked in the attention of her law firm partners, who praised her for making partner so young. Not many reach it before 31 of them, said, raising a glass. Kate smiled with practiced humility, her cheeks flushed with pride. My mother swooped in again, cutting in with her favorite line. I always knew Kate was destined for great things. She had the drive from the very beginning. It was as if she floated from group to group, weaving a story where she was the architect of their triumphs. Daniel would never have survived medical school without my constant support, she told a neighbor. Kate inherited her father's discipline, but her ambition. That came from me. The words slid over me like cold water. My father stood by the bar, a glass of soda in his hand. His shoulders slouched, his eyes darting to my mother as though bracing for what she might say next. When I caught his gaze, he gave me a small, weary smile. It was the look of a man who wanted peace at any cost. David leaned closer. You're doing fine, he murmured, sensing my tension. She can't take this moment from you. I tried to believe him. I kept repeating in my head, tonight is about Kate. Tonight is about family. Sus. But my mother's voice kept cutting through the music, louder than the quartet, sharper than the clinking glasses. At dinner, when the main course was served, I found myself seated between David and Daniel. My mother had arranged the seating chart, of course. Daniel talked animatedly about his clinic, telling stories that made everyone laugh. Then, in a moment of casual pride, he leaned back and said, "And of course, none of this would have been possible without Mom and Dad. They stepped in when my student loans almost buried me, paid them off completely. I'll never forget that." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I could feel the heat rise in my face, the pulse in my ears. He didn't know. He had no idea it had been me. I had emptied my savings for him, worked late nights on freelance projects, sacrificed vacations all so he could have the freedom to start that clinic. And now in front of 200 people, he was giving the credit to the very people who had begged me for the money in hushed phone calls. I forced myself to swallow, though the food felt like ash. David glanced at me, concern flickering in his eyes. I gave him the smallest shake of my head, begging him not to say anything. My mother, seated a few tables away, caught Daniel's words and beamed. She placed a hand on his arm, nodding proudly, letting everyone believe it had been her sacrifice. Inside me, something twisted. I wanted to stand up and shout, to tell everyone the truth, to drag out every receipt. But I bit down hard on my tongue. This wasn't the moment. Not yet. Instead, I smiled weakly when Daniel raised his glass in a toast, my hand trembling slightly as I lifted mine in return. The room glowed with candlelight laughter ringing around me, but all I could hear was the echo of his words. They paid them off completely. I lowered my glass, the knot in my chest tightening, and I knew with absolute certainty that silence wouldn't protect me forever. I rose from my chair napkin, trembling in my hand, and smoothed it across the table before setting it down. My heart thudded hard, but I steadied myself, reaching for the microphone that the MC had placed at the front of the room. I had practiced this moment, words about Kate, about family, about love and beginnings. David gave me a quiet nod of encouragement as I stepped forward, but before I could speak, my mother's voice cut through the air. Evelyn was suddenly there, her red dress gleaming under the lights, her smile broad as she slipped the microphone from its stand, like it had always belonged to her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice bright, commanding attention. The chatter quieted, forks stilled against china. "What a glorious day for our family. Look at my Kate, radiant as ever. And Daniel, oh, he has made us so proud with his clinic. Truly, I couldn't ask for better children." She paused, eyes sweeping the room, basking in the polite applause that followed. Then her gaze landed on me. Her smile didn't falter, but her tone sharpened. "And then there's Rachel." A murmur rippled through the guests as she tilted her head, voice pitched just enough to carry, "Con la dua vodong nyatnyane." Look at Kate today, all she's accomplished, all she is. And Rachel, well, what is there to be proud of? The words sliced through me, clear and brutal. The ballroom seemed to contract, chandeliers blurring in my vision as heat surged to my face. For a second I thought I hadn't heard her right, that surely she wouldn't say something like that here in front of 200 people. But the silence that fell confirmed it. Chairs creaked. Glasses clinked nervously. Guests shifted, some pretending to study their plates, others leaning toward their neighbors to whisper. David's hand gripped the edge of our table, his jaw tight. My father sat frozen, a flush rising in his cheeks. Kate's smile faltered as she looked quickly away as if pretending she hadn't heard. Daniel gave an awkward cough, straightening his tie, avoiding my eyes. Inside me, shame and fury collided. I felt the familiar sting. The same sting I'd carried since childhood. But this time it didn't settle into silence. My chest ached with the weight of it, but beneath that weight was something else, something steady. A clarity. I stood there exposed, humiliated, but suddenly aware that this was the moment I had always dreaded, and yet always known would come. Every dismissal, every cruel remark whispered at church or family dinners had built to this. And for the first time in my life, instead of shrinking into the background, I felt the urge to step forward. I looked around the room at the sea of faces, waiting to see if I would laugh it off, sit back down, or dissolve into tears. My hands shook, but not from weakness. My throat tightened, but not from fear. I realized standing in the center of that glittering ballroom that silence would cost me more than speaking ever could. I locked eyes with my mother, her expression smug, confident she had delivered the final word. And in that sharp, suspended stillness, I knew I was about to change everything. I took the microphone back into my hands, steadying my breath, and for the first time that night, I smiled. Not the nervous smile I'd worn all evening, not the polite one I'd rehearsed for my speech, but something calmer, sharper. If I'm useless, I said my voice even then, I suppose the money I've been paying out for the last 3 years must be useless too. The words dropped into the room like a weight. Silence fell so hard it was almost physical. The quartet stopped mid-note, a violin bow hanging awkwardly in the air. Plates stilled, forks paused mid-bite. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward me, then flicked to my mother. Evelyn froze, her lips parted, but no sound coming out. I could see the shock ripple through the tables, whispers starting, heads tilting. A woman near the back put her hand over her mouth. My aunt's wine glass trembled as she set it down too quickly, a splash staining the white tablecloth. David's hand found mine beneath the table, his grip firm, grounding me. He didn't need to say anything. The warmth of his palm against mine was enough, telling me he was here, telling me he wasn't going to let me stand alone. Daniel blinked, confusion flickering in his eyes. Kate sat rigid in her chair, her smile gone, her fingers twisting in her lap. My father stared at me, then at my mother, something dark settling in his expression. I let the silence stretch, holding it, refusing to fill the space with excuses or apologies. My smile didn't falter. The steadiness in my chest surprised me. I had always imagined that if this moment came, I'd be shaking, maybe even crying. Instead, I felt clear, strong. My mother's face shifted, her painted lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you talking about?" she snapped finally, but her voice was thinner than usual, stripped of its certainty. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied, my tone calm, almost gentle. That composure seemed to rattle her more than if I'd screamed. Around us, the ballroom waited. No one moved. Even the servers stood frozen by the doors trays balanced in their hands. The quiet was so complete that I could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights, the hum of the air conditioning. For 34 years, I had been the one to swallow my words, to take the sting and smile anyway, to let the moment pass unchallenged. But not now. Not after she had cut me open in front of everyone I knew. I breathed slowly, tasting the stillness, savoring the weight of their stares. I think I continued, my eyes never leaving hers. This might finally be the right moment to tell the truth. Gasps rippled across the room, chairs creaked as people shifted forward. I could feel the power in the pause, the collective anticipation. My mother's eyes darted from guest to guest, searching for someone to break the tension, to laugh it off, to change the subject. No one did. I glanced at David, who nodded once, steady and sure. Then I looked back at my mother. My smile remained, but it wasn't the smile of a dutiful daughter anymore. It was the smile of someone who had finally decided to stop being silent. And I knew, standing in that ballroom with the microphone warm in my hand, that everything in our family was about to change. I pulled my phone from the pocket of my dress and tapped open my banking app. The screen glowed against the ballroom's dim light, my thumb scrolling until the list of transactions filled the space. My voice didn't shake as I lifted the microphone again. September 4th, 2020. I read, "Transfer to Evelyn Miller, $1,200. October 2nd, 2020, $1,200. November 6th, 2020, $1,200. Every month for 3 years. $43,000. For the lease on the car my mother drives." The rustle of silk gowns and shifting chairs echoed through the silence. My mother's face drained of color. I kept going. March 15th, 2021. $5,000 to Central Memorial Hospital, out-of-pocket costs for Dad's gallbladder surgery. I looked at my father. Then his eyes wide, jaw set. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, his gaze slowly turning to my mother. Daniel fidgeted beside me, tugging at his collar. I scrolled further, holding the microphone close. August 20th, 2022. $10,000 to Catherine Miller. Bar exam fees and summer internship costs. Kate, congratulations on passing, by the way. My sister's cheeks flamed, her manicured fingers twisting the hem of her dress. She couldn't meet my eyes. And then the one that hit hardest. January 10th, 2023, $10,000 toward Daniel Miller's student loans. Funny, I heard tonight that Mom and Dad took care of those. But it was me. Every dollar. Daniel's face blanched. He shook his head, slightly stunned. I didn't know, he muttered, his voice barely audible. His wine glass rattled against the table as he set it down. My father pushed back his chair, the legs scraping against the floor. He stared at Evelyn, his hands clenched. "Is this true?" he asked, voice low and dangerous. Evelyn sputtered, her red lips tightening, but no words came. That was when my grandmother stood. Maggie Brooks, 84 years old, small in stature, but towering in presence. She planted both hands on her cane and spoke in a voice that carried across the room. "If Rachel is useless, Evelyn, then you don't know what worth means." Gasps rose from the tables, and then silence fell again, thicker this time. My grandmother's eyes blazed as she looked at her daughter. "This young woman has been paying your bills, carrying your family, giving everything she has, while you belittle her in public. Shame on you." The weight of her words pressed down on every guest. No one dared move. Even the string quartet sat frozen instruments resting limp in their laps. I stood there, my phone still glowing in my hand, my chest rising and falling with steady breaths. For once, I wasn't trembling. I wasn't invisible. The room was mine, the truth laid bare. My mother looked around desperately, as if searching for someone to rescue her, to laugh it off, to change the subject. But every eye in that ballroom was fixed on her, waiting. The hum of whispers had stopped. The air itself seemed to hold still. I lowered the phone slowly, the list of transactions still open like evidence stamped in black and white. My voice dropped, calm but cutting. "So tell me again, Mom. Tell everyone here how useless I am." Her mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. The chandeliers above glinted coldly, the silence pressing in until it felt like the whole city was holding its breath. And in that suspended moment, for the first time in my life, the balance of power had shifted. The silence cracked like glass. A low murmur swept across the ballroom, voices, hushed but urgent, guests leaning in close to whisper. Heads turned, eyes darted between my mother and me, as though the whole room was caught between disbelief and the irresistible pull of scandal. Kate sat stiffly at the head table, her bouquet trembling slightly in her grip. Her face burned red, and for the first time that evening, the glow she had carried as the bride faltered. I saw her glance at our mother, then back at me, her lips pressed tight. She had wanted this day to be perfect, to belong entirely to her, and now it was unraveling in front of every partner at her law firm, every family friend, every person she'd ever wanted to impress. My mother cleared her throat, clutching the microphone like it was a lifeline. "Families help each other," she began, her voice strained but reaching for authority. "That's all this is. Normal support. We don't keep score in this family." I felt laughter rise in my chest, not out of humor but incredulity. Before I could answer, my father stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor made several people flinch. Thomas rarely spoke in moments like these. He preferred the background, keeping the peace. But his face was flushed, his voice firm as he cut through the air. "The bank of Rachel is closed," he said. His tone was final, heavy, louder than the whispers. "From today on, that ends." Gasps rippled across the tables. My mother's head whipped toward him, eyes wide. "Thomas, you don't mean—" He didn't let her finish. "I mean it. Enough." At the vendor table near the wall, Emily, clipboard still in her hand, stood frozen. Her mouth parted slightly as she looked from me to my mother to my father. Later she would tell me she had planned dozens of weddings, but had never witnessed anything like this. In that moment, she looked like she was trying to memorize every second as if she knew the story would echo long after the flowers wilted. The guests stirred, some standing, others shaking their heads. One of Kate's law partners muttered to another, "Did you hear that? All those years? It was her." A cousin at the next table leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering, "I can't believe Evelyn kept that secret." The buzz grew louder, gossip crawling through the room like fire through dry grass. Kate slammed her bouquet down on the table petals, scattering. "Mom," she hissed, her voice shaking with humiliation. "You ruined everything." Evelyn reached for her desperate, but Kate pulled back. For the first time all evening, my mother looked small, surrounded by the wreckage of the image she'd tried to build. I stood there, microphone in hand, and felt a stillness settle in me. Not relief, not triumph. Something deeper. For once, I wasn't the invisible daughter. I was the one they were all talking about, the one whose truth had split the night open. David rose quietly and came to my side, placing a steady hand on my back. "Let's go," he whispered. His voice was calm, gentle, but resolute. I looked once more at the sea of faces. Some sympathetic, some shocked, some disbelieving, and then lowered the microphone onto the stand. The string quartet shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to play. Servers pressed against the walls, eyes wide, trying not to stare. The air was thick, heavy with judgment, with disbelief, with the sound of my mother's pride cracking like porcelain. David offered me his arm and I took it. Together we walked toward the double doors at the end of the ballroom. With each step, the noise behind us seemed to grow. Voices rising, questions, spilling chairs, scraping. But I didn't turn back. As we reached the doors, I straightened my shoulders, my head high. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by shame. My heels clicked against the marble, sharp and steady, until the heavy doors opened and the cool night air swept in. We stepped outside, the city lights stretching in every direction, the hum of traffic drifting up from the streets below. I drew in a deep breath, the crisp air filling my lungs. Behind me, the ballroom buzzed with scandal. But out here, for the first time, I felt free. The morning after the wedding, my phone buzzed before the sun had even climbed over the skyline. I rolled over the apartment, still dim, and saw my father's name glowing on the screen. For a moment, I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear his voice. "Rachel," he said, his tone rough, like he hadn't slept. "I'm so sorry." I sat up in bed, clutching the phone. "Sorry for what? For not stopping her, for letting her talk to you that way all these years. For sitting silent when I should have stood up." His words broke apart like stones tumbling loose. "You've carried more than any of us, and I let you do it alone. I don't know how to make it right." My throat tightened. For so long I had wanted to hear something. Anything that sounded like acknowledgement. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered. "That means more than you know." That day and the ones that followed, the calls came in waves. Daniel reached me 2 nights later. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Rachel." I didn't know," he said, voice low. "I thought Mom and Dad covered the loans. If I'd known it was you, I never would have let her." He trailed off. "I owe you everything. I don't even know how to start fixing that." "Start by seeing me," I answered. "Not just as background noise. As your sister." He was quiet, but when he finally spoke, there was something raw in his tone. "You're right. I've been blind. I'll do better." Kate was harder. She called on the 3rd day, brittle and defensive. "You humiliated me, Rachel." "On my wedding day," I let the silence stretch before answering. "I didn't humiliate you. Mom did when she decided tearing me down mattered more than building you up. All I did was tell the truth." She snapped back at first, but the fight bled out of her quickly. By the end of the call, she said nothing, just a hollow exhale. It was the closest she'd come to conceding that she had no defense. And then there was my mother. Evelyn called again and again, 6 times in a single afternoon. Her voicemails grew frantic. "You're being dramatic. Then, you're tearing this family apart. Then I don't know what's gotten into you." By the fourth day, the tone shifted. "Rachel, please, I shouldn't have said what I did. Maybe I was too harsh." On the sixth, her voice cracked. "I need to talk to you. Just us. Please." I ignored them all until the envelope from the bank arrived. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter unfolded in front of me, confirming what I already suspected. A $15,000 line of credit in my name, signed electronically with details only my mother could have known. The letter was matter of fact, but to me it was a scream. That night, I drove to Naperville. My mother opened the door, her face pale when she saw the papers in my hand. "You opened a loan in my name," I said, without preamble, pushing past her into the kitchen. She closed the door, her fingers tightening around the knob. "It was temporary," she began, her voice small. "We just needed—" I slammed the letter down on the counter. "This is fraud. Do you understand that it's illegal? You crossed every line." Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing but steel. "I've already carried you for years, Mom. I've paid for your car, for Dad's surgery, for Daniel's debts, for Kate's exam. And now this— Enough." She reached for me, but I stepped back. "I won't go to the police. Not this time, but you need to hear me clearly. No more. No more money. No more insults. If you cross me again, I'll cut you out of my life completely." For once, she didn't argue. She just sank into a chair. Her shoulders slumped, her mouth opening and closing like words had abandoned her. I left her there, the letter still on the counter, the kitchen lights harsh and unforgiving. Driving back into the city, the weight in my chest eased for the first time. Not gone, but lighter. I had drawn the line, and this time I meant it. 1 year later, I stood on a wooden dock overlooking Lake Michigan, the water glittering in the late summer sun. A soft breeze carried the scent of wildflowers we had tucked into mason jars lining the aisle. The setting was nothing like Kate's grand ballroom. Ours was intimate, no chandeliers, no spotlight, just 60 chairs facing the water filled with the people who had shown up for us with love instead of judgment. My father, Thomas, stood at my side. He looked older, a little more worn, but there was pride in his eyes as he adjusted the veil over my shoulder. "You ready, kiddo?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I nodded, gripping his arm, more than ready. When the music began soft guitar strings instead of a quartet, we stepped forward. For years I had dreamed of this moment and dreaded it all at once, wondering who would walk me down the aisle, who would truly be proud of me. And now, with my father's hand steadying mine, I felt a quiet kind of peace. In the front row, my grandmother Maggie sat straight and tall despite her cane resting against her chair. She wore a navy dress, her white hair pinned back neatly, her smile wide and fierce. She caught my eye as I walked past, and she gave me a nod as if to say, "You did it." Daniel and Kate were there too, sitting side by side, their expressions reserved. They hadn't offered speeches or grand gestures, but they came. And in its own way, that meant something. For once there was no edge of rivalry in the air, just a kind of uneasy truce. And then my mother, Evelyn, sat a few rows back, her posture careful, her face composed. She clapped politely when I appeared, though her eyes didn't shine with the same pride she'd once reserved only for my siblings. She hadn't tried to take control of this day, hadn't made demands or cutting remarks. Her presence was quiet, almost contrite, as if she finally understood there was no place left for her cruelty here. David stood waiting at the altar, his suit crisp, his smile radiant. The moment I saw him, everything else faded. My chest loosened, and for the first time I let myself believe I was stepping into a life built on my own terms. The ceremony itself was simple, beautiful. We spoke our vows in voices that shook with emotion, but never wavered. David promised to see me, to honor the woman I was, not the shadow others had painted. I promised to trust him, to let love soften the hard edges I had carried for so long. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, applause rose warm and genuine, echoing over the water. At the reception, held under a white tent strung with lights, Laughter and music filled the air. My father gave a speech that left me in tears. He stood before our guests, raising his glass, and said, "My daughter Rachel has always been the strongest person in this family. She gave more than any of us realized, and I'm proud to walk her into this new chapter." His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. "David, you're lucky. Take care of her." Even my mother managed words that surprised me. She stood briefly holding her glass with both hands. "Rachel," she said, her voice quiet, "I know I wasn't always the kind of mother you needed, but I want you to know I'm glad to be here. I wish you and David happiness." It wasn't an apology wrapped in grandeur, just a single sentence spoken plainly. And for the first time, that was enough. After the toasts, I slipped away for a moment, standing at the edge of the lake, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. The water lapped gently against the shore, and in the distance, gulls cried out. I thought about the year that had passed, how I had finally said no, how I had cut off the endless flow of money, how I had stepped out of the role of invisible daughter and built something real. I had bought a small condo in Chicago with my own name on the deed. I had been promoted to director at Brightwave, a title my mother had once dismissed as meaningless, but one that meant the world to me. Most importantly, I had built a life with David that wasn't weighed down by secrets or shame. The revenge, if that's what you'd call it, wasn't in humiliating my mother or exposing her lies, though that moment had been powerful. The sweetest part was standing here now knowing I had taken back my voice. Sometimes the only revenge you need is to smile, tell the truth, and keep moving forward, while those who tried to diminish you sit in silence. As the sun dipped lower, David came up behind me, slipping his arms around my waist. "Penny." "For your thoughts," he murmured. I leaned back into him, closing my eyes. "Just thinking about how far we've come." He kissed the top of my head. "No looking back. Just us now." And he was right. No more trying to earn approval that was never freely given. No more hiding the weight of sacrifices no one else wanted to carry. I was done being the invisible one. Now, as I stood there in my wedding dress with the man I loved, surrounded by the people who had chosen to support me, I finally felt whole. Have you ever been in that position? Looked down on, underestimated, treated like you didn't matter, and then found the courage to stand up for yourself? I'd love to hear how you handled it, how you turned the tables, how you found your voice. Share your story with me, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that none of us are truly alone in this.